Welcome to Cal Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, Plan Making, History, and Future. Today's presentation is on the textbook Urban Land Use Planning by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, State of the Community Report. My name is Professor Scott Reimers. The beginning part of this presentation is going to focus on the State of the Community Report. The State of the Community Report is made up of two different tasks, one that's more oriented towards information analysis, and another that's oriented towards building consensus. Those steps are not taken sequentially, one after the other. They're interactive processes that likely will happen together at the same time. The result of both of those tasks at the end of them will be a State of Community Report. So the first portion of the plan is the information analysis track. There is another track, we'll talk about that on the next slide. In the information analysis track, it's basically what we've been doing and what the lectures have been based on over the last few weeks. And that's where you start to look at what is the population, what are the population forecasts and estimates, what is the economy made up of, where's the economy headed, what growth sectors are there, what's kind of declining, what is your existing land use mix, what existing transportation infrastructure is there, and are there any new transportation coming, like a mass transit or light rail, things like that. And then how are things in terms of infrastructure? Do you have how's the sewer system? How's the water system? So you're going to look at all those different pieces, and from that you're going to identify certain issues. And those issues are going to be brought out to the front when you start building your different scenarios. The State of Community Report comes from not just the information analysis track, but also the consensus building track. That track begins with a design participation program. From there, one then moves on to actually doing outreach, involving itself in different organizations in the community, with the goal of building consensus. Two major tasks within that larger track is testing different scenarios with the public and creating a vision with the public. This track is more than just community participation. You're trying to involve the public in the decision-making process. But also, we tend to kind of rely on involving the public as a piece, but we don't think about also informing the public. So coming to a connection or coming together on a unified amount of information helps create common knowledge, common set of values. It also allows you time to get historical information about the community. It helps you figure out what issues are out there, and then eventually it's going to help you develop the different scenarios that then may lead to your preferred plan. The other benefit of doing good consensus building is that it builds social capital. That's really important early on in the process to get people to come into the room, to share ideas together, and when stakes are low is going to help when stakes become high and the commission or the council is approving your plan. So both the information analysis track and the consensus building track come together and feed into the State of Community Report. The State of Community Report is intended to summarize all of your key findings through those different pieces. So all of the key information you've collected, what are the key findings that came out of that? And what was the key information that came out of your community outreach and consensus building? So it's going to have a large set of facts, and it's going to have also a large set of values. And that's why the textbook writers, the authors, talk about this as kind of a left brain, right brain exercise. Remember that the format here needs to be more than just a text-based document or a bunch of boring graphs. Really, you need to make this as accessible as possible so that the public uses it. Think using infographics that show both existing conditions or future conditions, and also think about how this is going to be used not just for your existing, but also future audiences. There may be people who aren't involved early on in the process, but you want people who get involved later to be able to pick up this document and very quickly understand key information about what's happening in the city and what the values are in the community. So now that we've talked about the overall sort of outline of the different tasks that are involved in developing the State Community Report, we're next going to talk about that issue identification portion and the scenario construction portion. It's key to remember that these two pieces, the issue identification and the scenario construction, are integrated together. And remember that each community is unique, and so this process is going to be different for every city. The process that we went through in Temple City was very different than the process we went through for Pasadena because they're very different communities. However, despite that, there are a lot of standard tools that you will be bringing to the table in terms of community outreach, or that your consultant is going to tell you or suggest that you use. First, we tend to focus on identifying the issues in the community, and then after we've identified the issues, then we start creating some different scenarios, and we test those scenarios against those issues that we developed. So we'll talk more about that. But first, you identify the issues, then you create the scenarios, and then you test those scenarios against those issues. So let's get into issue identification. When you're looking for issue identification, you're looking at what the public is saying, and then you're trying to find comments, statements where there is dispute occurring, where something is unresolved, where things are being debated. When in Pasadena we looked at issue identification period, we put together at the end of that a community outreach summary report that had 7 or 8 different issues that really came to light. Neighborhood preservation was a major piece. There was a lot of talk about that. There was a lot of talk about traffic and congestion and our role within the broader regional transportation network. There were issues about growth and how growth should occur and whether too much growth had occurred and whether future growth should occur. So your issue identification period, you're going to see a range, and it's going to be different for every single community. So after you've worked on identifying those issues, then you're going to start developing scenarios. And scenarios, it's important to realize, need to be reasonable, but they also need to result in some different futures. So you don't want them to be too idealistic. They have to be reasonable and probable. And they need to be dramatically different, though, that people can tell the difference and that your indicators will be different. Usually the process is you first determine what's not going to change. So transportation infrastructure like freeways, probably not going to change. If you have a light rail system, that's likely not going to change. But if you have a new light rail system coming in, then maybe that's going to change. Things that aren't going to change, you might have areas of historic preservation where you're not going to expect a large amount of construction, so that's going to be an area where you're not going to propose a lot of growth. You might have conservation areas. It might be a protected wetland, or it might be a hillside, or a wildfire hazard area, or maybe a forested area. Those are going to be areas for conservation. Or maybe just in general, your place in the regional economy. If it's a very small city that's mostly a bedroom community, it's not likely that you're going to become an industrial hub or a major workforce hub within a 10-year time frame of your plan. So your place in the regional economy is probably going to stay the same. But determine what is uncertain and what can change. There might be societal changes, technological changes, environmental changes, economic changes. Technological changes we've seen with the growth of the internet. After COVID, we saw a lot of people working from home. We saw a major disruption about how people go to work and when they go to work and how often they go into work. So are we expecting that to continue? From an environmental perspective, if we're seeing an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and we're seeing some climate change and we're expecting sea levels to rise, then that environmental change may result in some changes in policy. There may be economic changes. There might be a closing of an industrial plant. In Southern California, we had a major economic change when the aerospace industry left. So you want to plan for those uncertainties. And then you take those issues and you use them as criteria to judge the scenarios. So if you have a city that's an infill city where traffic congestion is going to be a very important piece, you could use that. as a way to evaluate your different scenarios. You could look at jobs housing balance. You could try to, if you have a larger community, you could try to create a better jobs housing balance. No matter what, though, an important piece is to be sure that you're looking at the fiscal impact of your general plan or your land use changes. So you're going to want to see, does this improve the city's fiscal stance, or does it create additional problems? When it comes to building community consensus, there are three major challenges that the authors pull together. The first is designing a fair yet efficient process. We all want a fair process, and the problem is that we have to balance that against the process being efficient. To get a fair process, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of resources, but that has to be weighed against getting the project done. You can't take 10 years to do a community plan and then it's only a 10-year plan. It needs to be done in an efficient, timely manner. So designing that fair, efficient process is a challenge. Sharing control of the planning agenda. So might be someone's temptation as a planner to say, well, I wanted to be a city planner. I went to school. I'm going to control the results of this general plan because I know what's best for this community. But as planners, we need to share the control. To what degree? That's a challenge. Are you going to share it by just getting community input and then you become the gatekeeper and decide what gets folded in and what doesn't? Are you going to have a general plan advisory committee that makes sure that control is being shared with them and that their input is being received? In any case, you're going to have to share some control once it gets to Planning Commission and City Council, because the Commission will be giving advice to the Council, and the City Council in the end is going to either have to approve or deny your recommendation. So designing a fair yet efficient process, sharing control of the planning agenda, how much, and then thirdly, acting as a process manager or acting as a voice to the general public. Some of us as planners may move to one side or the other. Some of us may want to focus more as a process manager. Well, I'm just here to push the process forward, to manage the participation, and then whatever comes out, comes out. That kind of allows the planner to hide in a way. Some of us, though, might be more of an activist at heart, and we might have really specific values and ideas about what should happen, or we might want to speak out for community groups that haven't been heard, and we want to be that voice. So trying to manage that kind of third-party overseer versus being active in the community debate can be a challenge. So be careful of those three things. The second section of this presentation looks at two different techniques in terms of building community consensus. One is scenario testing, and the second is visioning. It's important to know that, again, not one size fits all. There's going to be a lot of different paths. Every community is going to walk through this process differently. But you need to have a unique, sensitive approach no matter what city you're working in. So our authors divide this into 3 steps. Notice I didn't say easy steps. The first is the pre-plan making step. Within that step, you need to identify the stakeholders who are out there. Often that's something you would do and then place them as your general plan advisory committee members, or it's an exercise you would go through with your general plan advisory committee to figure out who the stakeholders are and then start doing some community outreach with them. Once that set of stakeholders, or once your general plan advisory committee settles on an outreach plan, then you would start to institute that outreach plan. This is when you start creating the organizational framework of your plan. And you start working with your committee or with some members of the community to discuss what's out there in terms of issues. It might be when you start your education component as well. The authors also talk about starting to begin testing scenarios at this stage in the process. I have not been a part of a process that front loads that early in the discussion. but that's a suggestion they have. This is also when, though, you start to develop a vision for the community. The next stage of the process is actually making the plan. So it's called plan making stage. This is when you're going to develop and respond to different scenarios. You're going to start meeting with large numbers of participants. You're going to start communicating with the broad public. You're going to try to develop consensus on what your planning goals are. You're going to analyze these different land use schemes. You're going to share those land use schemes and the results with the public. And then from there, you're going to select a preferred plan. You're going to write whole elements and present them to the public. And then you're going to write and present your final plan. The last stage is probably the stage that gets the least amount of interest and sometimes is put on the back burner and is forgotten. In California, we have to do an implementation measures as part of the general plan. And the suggestion here is an interesting suggestion from the authors. I've never seen this, but it's to really get the public involved in the plan implementation stage. So they're talking about getting a group of the public together to monitor whether the general plan is meeting the outcomes that it was thought to, in order to help create more public awareness, having them come and testify whether development proposals meet the general plan. And then that group would then feed into plan revisions. Again, I've never seen this before. It sounds like a really great idea. In California, though, we do require that the staff of an agency brings forward an annual report. That annual report has to go to a public hearing at City Council. Often it's, it has to go to City Council, not necessarily a public hearing. It often goes to Planning Commission first. So the Planning Commission in that way is kind of acting as your community group for implementation stage. So when we're looking at a collaborative planning process, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked when designing that program. So the authors give us a list here, and it really would be helpful to take each component of this and break it down so that at each stage of the community outreach process, you're answering all of these questions before you design that specific piece. Firstly, how will planning decisions be made? Are the decisions going to be made by staff, by a general plan advisory committee, by your planning commission, by the city council? It's good to know who's going to be involved in that decision-making process. In California, the state's Housing and Community Development Department has to be a part of that process because HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, has to certify the housing element. And that's often an iterative process that takes many months, if not a year, in order to go through. What role will the public have in that process? Is the public going to be just an advisory group, or are they going to share power in this arrangement? And what do you want to accomplish with the public in each stage? At this stage, are you seeking to inform the public? Are you seeking to be informed by the public? Are you trying to gain consensus or agreement? What do you need to learn, or what does the public need to learn? Who are the stakeholders? Who's going to be involved in this process? Are the stakeholders, examples of stakeholders might be residents, it might be neighborhoods or neighborhood associations, it might be certain interest groups like environmental groups, it might be certain groups of business people like your Chamber of Commerce or a group of realtors. It might be non-governmental organizations, schools, really large institutions that hold sway within the city, things like that. What special circumstances could affect which participation technique that you use? If you have a broad group of languages that you have to deal with, that might change what participation techniques you use. If you have a history of participation within the community and you have established groups, that might also change your selection of different participation techniques. Budget limitations, some of these are very expensive to do. So you need to take those into consideration as well. What participation techniques are appropriate? Now there's many different techniques you can use, from a charrette, which is a series of workshops over a short period of time in which the public gives input, Then a group of planners and designers get to work to draw up some new ideas. The public comes back, provides feedback on those different ideas, and the planners and the designers go back and do some modifications. And it's kind of this iterative process, usually over 3 days, in order to quickly get to a set of alternatives or scenarios. Beyond the charrette, it could just be a general workshop. It could be a set of surveys. It could be a focus group. You could have just a public hearing process. You could have a tour to get people to see sections of a city they don't normally see. You could have a large citywide open house to get a broad group of people into one place. You could have a community fair. You could have meetings, separate small meetings with a bunch of different community groups. You could have a series of lectures or a panel of people to come and speak on a different series of topics. So how should the participation be organized? That's another question. So typically what you would do is you'd put together a timeline of the major events in your planning process, and then you'd show specifically when people can participate. Here's an example of what that might look like. As we go through this slide, you'll see the different steps in the general plan process added to the slide, along with at the bottom when the community can participate. In this case, we're going to find a city where community participation is at every single step. So establishing your general plan advisory committee, creating a group of ground rules, the public could come and watch the GPAC meet. You might have an education phase where the public can come and listen to a series of lectures. Then you have a stage where you're identifying issues. Maybe that's where you're having a group of stakeholders. That's a form of community participation. Maybe you're having one-on-one meetings with these people. Then you develop the vision, the goals and objectives. And maybe at the beginning of that process, you have a workshop. And at the end of the process, you have a workshop to get feedback on the goals, objectives, and vision. Then you go and create alternative plans, and that might be something you do as a charrette, as I mentioned previously. Then you might have a time where you're selecting the preferred plan, and that might be done through a community-wide survey, or it might be a huge citywide open house where you're getting people's comments all at one time. Then in California, we can't forget the environmental review process. That typically would happen after you've created your scenarios and your preferred plan. And then you have the approval process with public hearings. And you would see multiple times, whether it's in front of the Planning Commission and the City Council, when the public could be involved there. Just one note, you want to use this same slide over and over again at basically every community meeting, every Planning Commission or City Council meeting you have, so people can know what the process looks like. Whether they're at the beginning of it, whether at the end of it. If they're at the end of it, what were all the steps to get them there? Hopefully that makes them more respectful, understanding that a lot has already been done. And then it is also helpful to show where they are in the process. So over time, that area that's in yellow here that says select preferred plan, that would move throughout the process so people can get a sense for where they are. The next set of slides is on scenario testing. And as I had mentioned earlier in the lecture, scenarios really need to be realistic and not just idealistic. It's a time for you to carefully analyze these different scenarios. In Pasadena, we used a number of different indicators to look at what the results of these scenarios would be. The major one were the fiscal impacts, but also we showed how much growth would occur, both in terms of residential and commercial. We showed how much of that growth was going to occur within a quarter-mile radius of light rail stations. We looked at which ones would have more or less VMT per capita, and we looked at a number of these different indicators. So this is what your scenario testing. It's important, again, that these be plausible alternatives. For instance, you wouldn't want to do an alternative that shows only growth. The only growth that's going to occur is commercial. That flies in the face of housing law that says that you need to provide for your regional housing needs assessment. So don't come up with alternatives that are not legally feasible or just not plausible. You want to limit those false expectations. So for instance, you don't want to create a no growth alternative. That's going to, again, get you in trouble with your regional housing needs assessment objectives. For the EIR, you will have to do a no project alternative, but that's a little bit different. It's going to have to undergo rigorous testing, and that's just a note that whatever alternative you select, you need to go and collect public comment on it and expect that comment to be pretty rigorous. And the other rigorous testing is your own analytics that are being brought to the table. So the authors, again, we're talking about this consensus building process. And the first process that they brought forward was the issue of creating scenarios. The second one that I want to walk you through is visioning. The visioning process is when you move from a broad set of values or goals and you start to narrow them down into actual physical plans. The authors then take some time to talk about Envision Utah. It developed in a kind of typical three-step process. And I bring this forward because it's probably a process that either you're going to go through as you update a general plan, or it's what your consultants might suggest. So the first question that Envision Utah used, which a lot of planners will use, is where should we grow? So you're going to have the public start with a mapping exercise. You're going to roll out a set of maps, and you might start to add information onto those maps, which are related to your information gathering stage. So you might already show where there's federal requirements for conservation or where there's environmental hazards. But you're going to allow the public to go through and say, well, here's some areas where we should not allow growth. And then maybe they're going to, a typical thing is to give them a bunch of chips, like poker chips, and have them place a certain amount of growth in certain areas of the map. And that's kind of just showing you where people want to preserve and where people want to grow. So that's the first question, where should we grow? The second is, how should we grow? And that's when they start to take those chips that they had designated in certain areas. This is more likely at a separate meeting. Once they've allocated those chips to certain areas of the city, then they're going to start to take colored chips. And then they're going to start to say, well, these colors signify certain things. We'd like to see this growth in this section of the city be mixed use, or we want this section to be all commercial, or we want this section to be, small bungalow courts, small low density apartments. So where should we grow? How should we grow? And then the last one is more focused on community design. And so that's when we've done this in Temple City with more of a specific plan, not a general plan. But this is where you then start to survey people about different types of development patterns in terms of like showing them photographs. This is the type of development we want. This is what we want it to look like. This is kind of the size that we're thinking about. And so you're going to look at the cost of different scenarios and decide how much land it eats up. And then you're going to publish these different scenarios with different graphics and indicators and descriptions, and then you're going to survey people. So that was part of what we did in Pasadena. After we developed these different alternatives through a charrette process, we then studied them, analyzed them, published a packet that went out to every single address in the city, residential address, and then to every business, where we allowed people to give input. And then, so it kind of looked like a magazine where each page of the magazine had a description of the alternative. It had a set of graphs to show them what the different indicator results would be in terms of maybe things like traffic or the city's fiscal stance. It had some pictures of what that might look like, that scenario might look like. And then there was a survey included where people could give feedback on what their preferred alternative was. So the last step in the process is keeping the community involved during that implementation stage. And as I mentioned, it's not something we typically see. Sounds like a really cool, neat idea to try and do to keep people interested and involved in the general plan process. I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit in California about what we require in terms of implementation. In California, the city or county has to provide an annual report to the City Council, to the Office of Planning and Research, known as OPR, and HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department. So that goes to them every year so that they can see how the cities are implementing their general plan. They're going to provide a very detailed report in terms of the regional housing needs assessment, whether the city is making progress towards those RHNA goals. That's published. The HCD has been changing that report and seeking more and more information every year. Now, those reports are calendar year based, so it's January to December, and then the reports are need to be taken to their city council by April 1st or before. And then from that, it then goes to the state OPR and HCD. The housing element, as I mentioned, is a very specific format, but the general plan, general kind of implementation programs, that's whatever format that the city desires. Typically, the general plan has a kind of a table of implementation measures and says when those implementations are going to be instituted, who's responsible for them. So the easy thing to do really is just to add another column to that table and then state what's the status of that. Have you made progress on it? And then that report then goes to your planning commission, city council, and then OPR and HCD. So to summarize, the process of creating a state of community report is really two pieces. There's the information analysis piece, and then there's the consensus building piece. And that information analysis piece and the public outreach process that comes along it, it's important to remember that those two things are integrated at a number of places. They're linked. They're not independent. They are interdependent. The more that the public learns about the planning issues involved, struggles with it, bases its input on that information, the better that plan is likely to be. So in both of those tracks, information analysis and consensus building, we've learned that issues will come up, and that those issues are going to affect both past, present, and future land use patterns and growth. And these issues and the public inform the creation of different land use and transportation scenarios. And these issues that we find through that early stages of the process play an important role in acting as the criteria for judging these scenarios. To build consensus in the process, the authors have provided a 3-step process, starting with pre-plan making, and plan implementation. We also learned about a different process, the visioning process, and the 3 questions there were: where should we grow, how should we grow, and then the community design options. So once that plan is adopted, the community involvement does not stop there. The community should continue to be involved in its implementation.